Hello, everybody, and welcome back to episode 7 of Black, Brown, Yellow, White. Today, I'm very happy to welcome Simon Tam, a well-known activist and musician of the band The Slants, which he also founded. Simon Tam has won the Mark T. Banner Award from the Bar Association and rose to prominence across the USA for winning a landmark case at the Supreme Court of the United States in 2017. He has featured in thousands of media in 129 countries, ranging from the New York Times to The Daily Show with Trevor Noah to Aljazeera. In addition to this, he has written a memoir called Slanted, How an Asian American Troublemaker Took on the Supreme Court, which was named one of the best books on the Constitution by BookAuthority. Also, he has given numerous TEDx talks, among them the tongue-in-cheek titled Give Racism a Chance. He is a co-founder of the Slants Foundation as well, a non-profit organization that provides support and pushes the envelopes in arts, civic engagement, and activism. Simon Tam famously calls himself a troublemaker, and today we'll be talking about racism, arts, empowerment, diversity, and more. So thank you very much, Mr. Cham, for having you here. Before we jump right into it at the beginning, I have this kind of difficult question which I ask my interviews, which is, would it be possible to give like a very brief, in a nutshell, account of your life and adventures thus far?
I think for me, ever since I was a little kid, I was really obsessed with music and with trying to find a way to alleviate suffering in others. Like as a kid, I would kind of beg my parents to give me spare change so I could give it to people in the corner who are
Yeah.
homeless, looking, asking for a sandwich. And just so I was like, well, can't we go buy them a hamburger or something like that?
Uh,
And I don't think I realized what that meant uh, until I got older. And then rather than asking, can we give them a hamburger or a sandwich, I started asking, why are they hungry? Why, we're supposed to be one of the richest countries in the world. Why do we allow such suffering to exist? And that's when I started thinking about these systemic issues. And I realized that music and art could be a very powerful tool to address those kinds of things. So I think
yeah.
my life has kind of been in this back and forth balance of being an artist, of someone who loves creating things, writing, performing music, and somebody who wants to use those forms of expression to address these kind of systemic issues of like allowing us to question like why things are the way they are, and perhaps more importantly, what can they actually become when we engage in our full sense of compassion and use all of our abilities and resources to address those kinds of things.
I'm curious because at least in my experience, this it seems to be quite rare that at the young age one already has so much, concern and empathy and action for these kind of concerns. Do you think this was some kind of inner development, or were there certain events that you remember that maybe guided you in that direction?
I mean, I think a lot of it probably came from my grandparents. I mean, my whole family, we grew up in poverty. We were on free and
Mm.
reduced lunch systems. And my mom was, she grew up as an indentured servant. And, like every member of my family has struggled pretty significantly. And I think that allowed them to have a certain empathy when they saw other people who are suffering. And it's hard when you grow up in an environment like that to not
Yeah.
take some of that in. So I think that a lot of it was just kind of taught of like, um, I grew up in a culture where it was very much like concern for other people. It's less about the individual, less about yourself, and more about how you play a role in a larger society of people. And when you think about it like that, it's like, well, what does it mean when my life is interconnected with those around me, whether
Yeah.
they complete strangers or my neighbors or members of my family? You start realizing that we all play a role in trying to, reduce suffering in the world.
Yeah. And actually, that really connects to the next set of questions, which is kind of also looking at some of your sources of inspiration. You mentioned your parents. Can you maybe just flesh it out a little bit, or maybe there are also, in addition to your parents, also some other figures, activists or historical figures who inspired you?
Yeah, I mean, I think my family was definitely a big part of that. And I didn't actually even realize their full story till I was an adult, like hearing how they grew up and how they had to endure a lot of suffering and kind of
Mm,
tribulations to be able to get where they are. So I think just seeing how they were able to um, approach life like the amount of sacrifice that they had for our family and for our community members, and just watching that, I think instilled within me a pretty deep work ethic of like, okay, this is a core part of who I am, is like I can do better. I don't have to do the bare minimum. I will try and engage my passions to do more in this world. And there were other folks that I met throughout my life. There was a local youth pastor named Alan Diaz, who's a mentor of mine who, kind of took me on trips to throughout Latin America where I would learn how to like work with orphanages and community centers to kind of
mm,
work with people there and establish leadership. And one thing that he always impressed on me, he had this quote he'd always tell me. He said, "There's three kinds of people in this world: those who wait for things to happen, those who make
yeah.
things happen, and those who wonder what the heck just happened." And he said, "Simon, you be one who
Yeah.
makes things happen." And so I think he was really instrumental in teaching me about taking action, and not just doing something for other people. Like, yes, that's important, but helping
Uh-huh.
them understand the mechanisms to establish their own leadership. So rather than just like bringing a bunch of food and clothing into countries like Mexico and giving them to people,
Yeah.
we figured out how do we work with local community leaders to solve problems at their level. And that really started kind of putting into my mind this understanding of like, oh, okay, there's like systemic issues that we need to address. And I think all along the way in my career in both the nonprofit world as well as art, I started kind of getting these bits and pieces from different people and realizing, okay, there's a vision I could have for my own life,
Yeah.
and having a unique path that I could take to try and bring these ideas of, justice and dignity to other people.
Okay. Um, so I also get a sense from how you've described it now that your trajectory has been across many um, different cultures and different communities. And I was interested in if there are aspects of certain cultures or certain communities that have also stuck with you or have inspired you or have given you impulses.
I think the more that I kind of traveled around the world, the more I realized how there are more similarities within different communities that transcend language and culture than we think. A lot of
Mm,
times we think about how different we are. Even in the United States, people are always thinking about political division or how like
yeah,
people in the deep South are very different than people on the West Coast. But at its core, I think we don't have different values. I think we have similar values. We just have very different ideas of how to express those values in public. So, what does it
mm,
mean to be safe? What does it mean to be family oriented or community oriented? And what does it mean to prosper? All those different ideas might help shape policy. But when we concentrate on the differences, that's when we feel a lot of division. Whether it's like remote villages in Mexico or,
mm,
cities like Valencia, Spain or Tokyo, Japan,
yeah,
I start realizing like, oh, there's a lot of these core ideas that start appearing throughout, and everyone to some degree has an idea of what justice feels like. We might not be able to articulate it, but we
yeah,
understand inherently when something is unjust, when something's wrong. And
yeah,
we understand that it's important to help other people. So I think that that's one thing that I've really learned as I kind of spent a lot of time traveling. and exploring different cultures, it's like, wow, there's a lot of these inherent similarities, and some might emphasize, some aspects more than others. I tend to find in, Latin-based countries and a lot of Southeast Asia, like
Mhm.
the idea of like community tends to be stronger than
Yeah,
in the States. But it doesn't mean it's totally absent here either.
yeah. Yeah, what you said also just reminded me of this theory I heard about I can't put it nicely into words, but of this that there is something like an inner voice, usually with people, that kind of gives you an idea of what is the right thing to do and the wrong thing to do. And if you go away from that, if you go against that voice, you have to kind of make up excuses and etc. Yeah.
Yeah, I think
Um,
there's a lot of us that when we ignore it, we try and justify it in various ways, right? And I
yeah,
mean, even the most atrocious acts of human history have been justified in some kind of way, and they usually try and justify it with some other kind of value or
yeah,
by distorting it. But at its core, I think whether you speak the language or not, whether you've even been to another place, you can still feel empathy for someone who's suffering. Like
yeah,
right now, a bunch of earthquakes and global disasters, particularly in the outer Pacific Rim. And we can see, like, wow, when people lose their homes, something in us, even if we don't know them at all, thinks like, that's awful. Like, what, like something needs to be done. And I think we just as humans on this earth need to tap into that compassion a little bit more, tap into that empathy, because I think it makes us better people than when
yeah,
we miss that, when we harden our hearts.
yeah. We're already very close to our main topic, but I just still quickly, in terms of inspiration, would like to ask you. We can see clearly in the background that music is one probably your main passion or one of your main passions, and yeah, I was thinking in the field or in the area of music, what are the things that have inspired you, that keep inspiring you?
Well, these days, I think that my greatest source of inspiration is just this upcoming generation. So I helped co-found this nonprofit called the Slants Foundation, and
Mm,
we spend our time and our resources mentoring and funding and investing in up and coming artists who are using their music and their activism in a way to create social impact. And it's funny because like we're the mentors. We're supposed to be like helping shape their careers and teaching
mm,
about the industry and how to like partner with organizations.
yeah,
But really they inspire me every day by their creativity, by their capacity to just think of new ideas and new ways of seeking change.
mm,
So these days, I would say the artists that we're mentoring are probably my greatest source of inspiration. They're just always teaching me so much about life, about what's possible, and I think that's just, I wouldn't have it any other way. It's been
mm.
by far the most rewarding thing I've ever done.
And how do these artists actually come to you, or do you seek them out, and or does it have to be a certain kind of music, certain kind of, yeah? How does this whole
Oh,
thing kind of work?
yeah, it's kind of a both. Like people can contact us through our website, through social media, but we also do like a call for artists every year. We will have
Mm,
some kind of new program and say, hey, if like this year, for example, we're funding 10 artists to write songs about social cause that they're passionate about, and we challenge them to work with the community organization that's centered around the issue. Because I
yeah,
find a lot of times artists work in isolation, like, oh, I care a lot about climate change, but they aren't exactly working with people who are addressing the issue. They just like, I'm going to write a song about the climate, or I'm going to write a song about the opioid crisis, or something like that.
yeah,
And I'm like, why not work with people who are on the ground, who are crafting legislation, who are impacted, to hear their stories and use that to inform your art, and then you can partner with them to like support their work,
yeah,
and they can do the same for your art. So that's our newest program right now. It's called Asian Pacifics,
yeah.
and it's just been very, very inspiring to see like, wow, like both learning about these issues from them and why it matters to them, but also to see, what they can do when they use their artistic creativity and apply that to that social justice
Mm.
lens.
Okay, that's really great to hear. I'll circle actually back to this theme. So now we already actually moved to the kind of, I call it the core part. I don't know if that makes sense, but and the questions are going to be really quite blunt because I think I want to leave the interviewees just space to develop what they think and also to have this consistency from one person to the next. Basically, the question is, what is your understanding of racism and where do you kind of see both its causes as well as its effects?
Yeah, I think at least in the United States, we have kind of two main ideas about racism.
Mm,
One at its core, it's a belief, right? It's a belief that one or more races are superior to other races, or some races are inferior than others. And I think as a belief, it can be articulated by individual prejudice. So, like,
yeah,
we don't like people of a certain ethnic identity or nationality or race. We like other people, and it might
mm,
come across as preferential treatment. But I think the more important definition of racism is one that's more pernicious, one that's more
yeah,
complex, and that it is actually a system, a social structure in which one or more races benefit at the cost of other races.
yeah,
One race might have additional privileges or get access to resources or influence over others. That's a much tougher one
yeah,
because these days we're told racism is more like the former, like, oh, look at these people being treated poorly, and less of like we live in a society that actually reinforces those ideas. And so a lot of my work is teaching people to think more upstream, think more like what are the root causes of these kinds of things.
mm,
One of my favorite quotes is from Desmond Tutu, who says, at some point we got to just stop pulling people out of the river and go upstream to think, why are they falling in to begin with?
yeah,
And I think when we think about why we see such inequality in our world, it's not because of the belief. I mean, people believe all sorts of things. People believe in a
yeah,
flat earth. It doesn't make that so. It
yeah,
is actual social structures that reinforce those beliefs. And so I think the greatest victory for people who believe in these unjust ideas is convincing people that racism is about belief.
yeah,
When we look at the massive social movements, particularly in the 1950s and the 1960s, a lot of those activists like Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, they didn't focus on belief, they focused on structures. That's why they
mm,
wanted to see major legislative reforms like the Civil Rights Act. And then shortly after that, it became positioned as a belief. Oh, we're being treated poorly because people don't like us, as opposed to like because that's how our entire legal system is structured. And
yeah,
so that's the challenge these days is helping people understand that really difference. They come from a very similar place, but how they work in a civil society are very, very different.
yeah. Um, and in this age, where do you see in the USA like the main manifestations of racism in which ways?
I think in every measurable outcome possible, you
Yeah,
see a major disparity in race. So if you look at income inequality, white families earn, you know, 8 times more than typical black family, and I think about 4 or 5 times more than typical Latin family.
yeah,
Uh, If you look at education outcomes, if you look at healthcare, if you look at life expectancy, all of these things can be broken down by race, and you'll see significant differences
mm,
uh, across the board. And that's where it's like really interesting because it's like if racism didn't actually exist in our world, then we wouldn't see such severe life expectancy differences. There's nothing inherent in our DNA that says I, as a person of color, ought to live less long than somebody who's not.
Yeah.
We start realizing, okay, then, there's elements in our healthcare system. There's elements in our financial institutions, like who gets the benefit of the doubt when it comes to credit, loaning, securing a home, being able to attend a school or getting a job. These differences start appearing, and
Yeah.
it's by very, very measurable outcomes, and they are consistent across time, like these differences. So I think in the US in particular, uh, almost every single area that you can think of
Mhm.
where you measure like is race a factor in the outcome, we see that it pretty much is.
Yeah. And so, in the spirit of these open, blunt questions, you as an activist, what would you say have to be the major ways of addressing this and confronting this systemic um, racism? Yeah.
Yeah, so I think in terms of racism, it goes back to that like kind of multi-part definition, right? There's the
Mm,
system part, and then there's the individual.
mm,
And so when you think about how we're going to move the different levers of like addressing racism, we kind of have to address multiple parts at the same time. So there's the institutionalized forms, and that means,
mm,
reforming our laws, our forms of government. There's also kind of addressing the cultural parts of it, because I think culture is actually upstream of policy. It influences our behaviors and our beliefs, and that's why I think art is such a very powerful tool in addressing that, because it can change the culture. And then
mm,
there's that final individual piece. But I think really, if we're focusing efforts on um, making culture more justice oriented, more equitable, have better, more human centered forms of representation,
yeah,
that's be a big part of it. And if while we're addressing the structural inequities, so that means like, reforming laws and that sort of thing. I think by focusing on those two, we can actually address by its virtue, some of that innate personal form of discrimination.
yeah,
And one example I'll give of like how that's worked in my lifetime is, growing up, I never uh, imagined being able to see same-sex marriage as a possibility in my lifetime. Uh,
yeah.
I grew up in California, and people think of California as this liberal bastion, right?
That's
But
exactly.
but as I was coming into voting age, the state was actually passing constitutional amendments that defined marriage as a contract between a man and one woman, and
Mm,
multiple states were passing this legislation at the same
mm,
time. So, uh, in my 20s and early 30s, the vast majority of Americans were opposed to same-sex marriage.
yeah,
So that's just like, this is no way like that's going to happen. But then we started seeing things change in the culture. We had television shows like Will and Grace. We had films that depicted same-sex relationships in a really
mm,
thoughtful and holistic manner. And then all of a sudden, shortly after that, within just a few years, we saw Oberfeld, the Supreme Court case that legalized same-sex marriage. And then when they redid polling, they saw the vast majority of Americans now support same-sex marriage.
yeah,
So it was that both that cultural piece, like all these forms of entertainment, storytelling that got people to wake up and think, "Wow, that's my neighbor. Those are my kids."
yeah,
That's how they feel as human beings. And then there was also the structural piece of like addressing the law, and that actually ended up shaping the individuals.
yeah,
So if you think of it like a three-legged stool, you can't just focus on one leg. The entire thing
yeah.
will still struggle. You have to address all of it if you really want to um, bring a balanced but effective approach.
Yeah, yeah, this kind of multi-pronged approach because they all kind of support and feed off each other. And okay, so this is the topic of racism, which is challenging and difficult, but then also kind of complementary with it. I would like to look with you at diversity. So, what for you is diversities? What are your earliest encounters with it? Yeah.
I mean, I think diversity is one of these interesting ones because a lot of us look at diversity by some of the parts of our identity that we connect with the most or that we
Mm.
see expressed in society the most. So for a lot of us, that is going to be race and our ethnic identities because it's such a visual part of like the fabric of our society.
Yeah.
It seems very evident in our food and other forms of culture. But I think of diversity as like I like to think of it all as all forms of diversity, right? There's gender, there's sex, there's religion, there's um, ideas, in addition to kind of our race and our ethnic identities. And I think it's really, really important to have diversity practice in all of its forms because we aren't just our race. I'm not just my gender. Like we are all of these things interconnected. And so it's really important to have those different pieces um, as being able to be fully expressed by each person. And so it makes it even more complex, right?
Yeah.
Because now it's not just policy or culture around race. It's all of these things. And at its core, it's basically being able to see people as individuals and not necessarily these convenient categories. And I think for me, growing up in the United States, the earliest ideas of these things really were race because I grew up in the 1980s. It was a very tumultuous time where there was a lot of anti-Asian racism. I mean,
Mm.
I would turn on the news and I would hear about deaths of like people like Vincent Chin,
Yeah.
an auto worker who was beaten to death because someone thought he was Japanese because there was just a lot of this resentment, in particular around the economy.
Yeah.
Uh, People were angry about Japanese cars taking prominence in the United States. And even when I was at school, I was bullied pretty frequently. I was beaten up numerous times by other kids because they looked at me and they knew that I was different to them, even
Yeah.
though I was born and raised in the United States.
Yeah.
And so it like those things like really helped shaped me and realize that, whenever I saw other people being bullied for whatever reason, whether it was because of their race or because maybe they were seen as too nerdy or too whatever, I realized that like I had felt that way and I didn't want anyone else to feel that way because it just was awful.
Yeah.
And I think that's what started making me think about diversity is like there's all these different forms and we have to be willing um, to help others get there by connecting with that shared experience of like we all know what it feels like to be made small or invisible or reduced to some part of ourselves and to use that to drive like a compassionate response and say like we don't want other people to experience that.
Yeah.
I think helps influence our ideas about what is possible when we think about like what it is we want to see in change in our world. And but by tapping into that compassion, I think we can start saying, okay, that means we need more just systems. Then that means our culture ought to be more nuanced and diverse.
Mm. Mm. And uh, so yeah, there are many, I would say, or almost mostly positive aspects of diversity and the cultural exchange and getting to know different customs and getting to know different ideas, etc. But for you, where do you see like kind of the positive sides of diversity?
I mean, the positive sides are all over the place.
Mm.
As somebody who loves food, I'm like, I'm so glad that I don't have to only live with American food because it's
Yeah.
pretty boring, terrible.
Yeah.
Like I love seeing that exchange, or like, there's no question that our music and our films and our literature is made for the better by encounters with other cultures and ideas
Mm.
because it just enriches that experience. Like when somebody really loves creativity or exploration anytime that you can come across a new kind of human experience that is similar but different to your own,
Yeah.
it's really, really exciting. It's like being able to try a new dish or hearing music in a totally different fashion, totally new
Yeah.
instruments. I'm always like, it's just really exciting to see that, wow, as people, we are capable of doing so much and bringing so much into this world. As an artist, I'm always just like really excited because like
Yeah.
art is to me probably the closest thing that we can get to divinity. It's bringing something that doesn't exist into existence in this
Mhm.
world. I mean, that's just unbelievable. And to see how people can do it using their own cultural inheritance, using their own perspective, uh, it's just so exciting and thrilling to see. And so, yeah, otherwise our world would be incredibly bland and
Yeah.
monochromatic, boring. Like, yeah, I can. Uh, that is not something that excites me. I like that rich tapestry that diversity provides.
Thank you. That is extremely well put. So now we've covered racism, diversity, and the last one I think is a bit, at least for me, a bit more difficult to get that. What are your earliest experiences of having like a sense of agency, a sense of influencing your own affairs, and how did that influence your both your thoughts and your emotions?
So there's this story I often share about. It's one of my earliest memories of being bullied. It was in seventh grade, and we were at in physical education class. And back then, people would take different turns to clean up the PE field. Cleaning up the basketballs and volleyballs and sports equipment while everyone else would go and take showers before going back to class.
Yeah.
On one day when it was my turn, um, I thought I was alone, but then I really quickly realized I wasn't when, I was shoved to the ground. And when I look up, I see there's four guys standing over me, and it's extremely terrifying because they just began throwing sand in my eyes. They kicked me in the stomach. They hit me over and over again, and they keep yelling these two words, these slurs, Jap and Gook, which is a slur for someone who's Vietnamese.
Yeah.
And I just I didn't really know what to do until something in me snaps. I look at him and I said, "Well, I'm a chink," which is like a slur for someone who's Chinese.
Yeah.
That's how racist you are. You can't even tell the difference. Like you can't even be a racist,
Yeah.
probably. And it was so shocking to them that they stop and they walk away.
Yeah.
And there was this little lesson that planted in my young mind, which is that like only I get to define who I am. Other people don't have that right. And by claiming that identity, it gives me a sense of agency. It gives me a sense of power, saying like I refuse to be defined by other people. I will choose how I want to define myself. And I think that's along with other incidents in my life, what eventually shaped my 20s when I wanted to start an Asian American band.
Mhm.
Uh, we were one of the first like all Asian American bands in the country. And when I thought of the name, it was, it was actually came about from asking people around me who weren't of Asian descent. I was like, hey, what's something you think all Asian people have in common?
Yeah.
And they would say slanted eyes. And I was like, slanted eyes, like it's not true. Like not all of us have slanted eyes,
Yeah.
and we're not the only people to have any kind of slant to our eyes. But I thought back about that idea of like, claiming an identity, using it to flip the ideas that we have on its head, to turn stereotypes upside down, to empower ourselves. And then that's when I thought, oh, I'm going to name my band the Slants.
Yeah.
And uh, I didn't know it at the time, but it really put me on a very, very different path in my life, especially around arts and activism. And and I think really at its core kind of started shaping more and more of my ideas because a lot of people think like when we started this band that we were this like political force, that we were doing all this stuff for Asian American communities.
Oh,
That wasn't the intention. I
yeah,
just wanted to start a band. I thought, oh, this is kind of a punk rock name. It's kind of
yeah.
fun. And it wasn't until we were kind of a little bit more public that kids started writing to me saying, thank you for showing me what's possible. Thank you for giving me a reason to be proud of my heritage.
Mm,
And then I was like, wow, like whether we liked it or not, we're going to be judged by our race, by our actions,
yeah,
influencing these kids. So we need to take that responsibility seriously. We need to step it up and really make sure we're using that in a positive way. And so that's when we started working with community organizations around this country. That's when we started, doing anti-racism workshops and trying to do trainings and working with cities to try and develop policies that were a little bit more equitable and more just.
mm,
I, but it all comes back to that like feeling of when I was a kid of like how it felt to have my own identity weaponized against me
yeah.
and, what it meant to claim it for myself and to use
Mm.
that as a tool for change.
To get back some of the power of it. Yeah, this is actually a direction I'm very interested to connect this a bit more of your work and the experiences. So you have many years of experience in the music industry as a musician, and then also this experience as an activist. What would you say from your expertise is the role or the importance of music in raising and addressing issues of racism?
I mean, it certainly plays a role in that music is just one form of expression. And right, I for a long time I thought it was a different thing.
Mm,
Um, that art and activism were two different ideas. But then over time I started realizing that they're almost the same thing. They're about expression. They're about taking ideas that we have and not looking at the world necessarily as it is, but as it should be, right?
mm,
Artists take things from nothing and they make it into something like a painting or a song or a
mm,
theater piece. Activists do the same thing. They're like, what we don't have is a just world, and I'm going to bring that into existence step by step. Whatever actions I need to take, I'm going to start manifesting it into existence. And maybe it's taking an existing material like our existing government or some policy and bending it a little bit,
yeah,
shaping it. In the same way that a sculpture artist takes existing materials of the earth and creates something new, artists do the same kind of thing. We were like, okay, that's not the world we have, but it could be. And that world is better. It gives people more opportunities, it has better outcomes. It allows us to be proud of who we are as compassionate human beings. I would like to see that world exist. And so I'm going to start taking these things and making them whole, making them better. And
mm,
so I really think that you know, music plays a role in that because it is a form of activism. It is a form of bringing something into existence. And also, when people write music from a very genuine, authentic place, those stories help shape the culture, which makes the structural reforms possible.
yeah. Yeah, the three-legged or the three pillars you talked about earlier.
Yeah,
Um,
it could be used as like an accelerant, right?
yeah.
You're baking a cake, you introduce new ingredients to make the dough rise, and perhaps culture and art is a part of that process.
Hmm. You talked about just now a little bit earlier about that at one time at the same time negative but also kind of empowering incidents you had of racism, and I was curious in the US American setting. Can you see, is there any difference to speak about between, say, racism against Asian Americans, racism against Black people, or are these all very similar manifestations, or how do you see this?
I mean, I think when we think of like something go wrong in this world, like in injustice, I think it stems from a very similar place. In my opinion, it stems from selfishness.
Mm,
So I think corporate greed, for example, is a form of selfishness, like just manifested at a way different scale.
yeah,
And when we see inequality, particularly structural inequalities, it comes from selfishness. I want to take care of myself, or I want to take care of my own, so to speak. And when we think about efforts to reform, we think about the work of activism and the work of art. I think it comes from a place of love. It comes from a place of thinking about others and making and leveling the playing field so that everyone could experience some dignity. And so you have these kind of two opposing kind of emotions and values. And so I think when we look at it through that particular lens, I think at its core, you can see these elements appearing in all these different areas, whether
yeah.
it's in art or in structures or even in the relationships that we have in our lives. So
Mm,
I think they're at its core, there's that kind of similar thread that's woven throughout.
mm. Now, you have famously won a unanimous landmark case at the Supreme Court. I was going to ask if you could maybe, yeah, I know it's difficult, but just give a brief account from today's perspective, and also what the meaning is of this victory for you at this moment in history. And then the second part would be more generally, what do you think is the relevance of the judicial system in view of racism. But first, like a little idea of this case, how this went down, and the significance of that victory seen from today.
Sure. So in 2009, I applied to register a trademark for my band's name. It's something that's pretty mundane, but pretty
Mm,
important to do as a musician. Kind of like you want to get copyrights for your music. The trademark makes sure that you can use your name in the public without people stealing it, so you can get licensing deals and other sorts of things. Um, the government rejected our application because they said that the name of my band, the Slants, was disparaging or racist towards Asian people, even
yeah.
though we are all Asian and we were trying to reappropriate the term. And so we pushed back. We started saying, providing evidence of how our community supported us and gave dictionary definitions. We gave cultural surveys. We did all this other
Yeah.
stuff. And the government said it's not good enough because they were relying on a wiki joke website called urbandictionary.com. So we started changing that conversation. Instead of asking if we are offensive, we said why. Why do you say our name is offensive?
Yeah.
Because you've actually given the word slant as a trademark hundreds and hundreds of times. So what's different about this ban than every other person that's applied? And
Mm,
they came back and they said it's because you're too Asian to use the mark. It's precisely because you're Asian. Because in their minds, they're like, well, if you see the words the slants and you see a bunch of
mm.
Asian people, you're going to automatically think of the racial slur instead of any other definition in the dictionary.
Oh.
Which
Mm,
is just a more convoluted way of saying anyone can register the slants except for Asian people. And so
mm,
we pushed back saying that you can't use someone's race against them, and that maybe the law was actually violating my freedom of expression. Um, we fought for 7.5 years, and eventually it took us before
yes.
the Supreme Court of the United States. And
Yeah.
there we finally won. We got a unanimous decision where the Supreme Court struck down that particular law as unconstitutional, saying like, yeah, um, you can't punish people for having views that you disagree with,
Yeah.
essentially. So that's kind of the case in a nutshell. That was like 7 years ago, so it's a bit of time.
Yeah.
But I think for me, one of my biggest takeaways in terms of the legal system is that a lot of times we have um, laws and policies on its face that seem like a good idea.
Mm-hmm.
In its practice, we learned that they're not. So on
Mm-hmm.
its face, we're like, yeah, we don't want the government to register trademarks that are hateful, that use hate speech or that say terrible things. That seems like a pretty good idea to just stop that from happening.
Yeah.
But in practice, what we see is that language is subject to interpretation and it's subject to context. And so the reason why the government was giving everybody else this trademark was because they were getting the benefit of the doubt. They were giving all the non-Asian people the benefit of the doubt because they didn't understand how my community was using it. And when we did comprehensive studies around this law, we found out that it was actually targeting people of color. Because you think about who are the kinds of people that reappropriate language, tends to be
Mm-hmm.
people of color, women, members of the LGBTQ community. So basically, like political minorities in this country, because we did not get the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah.
And so when you think about other kinds of laws in our society, we see that, oh, this is why the government allowed and protected white supremacist marches in our city or cities across this country while they were cracking down on Black Lives Matter protests. Because
Yeah.
they saw one group as like, we can at least empathize and protect their right to protest, which is a constitutional right here. But when it became about marching for the rights of people of color, they're like, well, those are rioters. It's dangerous. They didn't see them as having the same constitutional rights. So it's like in practice, how a law is enacted matters just as much as what it looks like on its face.
Yeah.
And so that's why when we think about policies, we need to think both of like what it means in its proposal as well as what it means in its actual application. When you have imperfect, flawed human beings with a natural tendency for bias, what does a law look like in its most extreme state?
Yeah.
Because that's probably what's going to be happening. And
Mm.
so when we think about like structural reforms, it's really important to think about how things could be distorted in a way, especially to punish people with maybe less than favorable views, or more importantly, people who hold like minority views that might differ from those in power.
Yeah. So there can be very much unwanted outcomes when people just stick to the so-called letter of the law too closely.
Yeah, I mean, we end up with, because law is subject to interpretation. And so
Mm.
a lot of times we could have what's called a disparate impact or unintended consequences. And so that's why when we talk about reforming our laws, it's very, very important to get very precise and to think about like what it looks like in a civil society. So there's this old philosopher named John Rawlings
Mm.
who wrote this book called A Theory of Justice. And I love how he approaches it because he has this idea. He says justice is about fairness and
Mm.
it's about laws that we would all agree to no matter who is in charge. So basically, it's laws that aren't subject to our hidden biases and our interpretation.
Mm.
Those are the laws that are most fair. And so, as I think about like structural reforms, I'm always keeping that in the back of my head. Like, how do we guarantee that it protects us from being ruled against by the dominating group, but also how does it make sure that when we get into that position, when people we like get into positions of power, that we don't turn into fascists, that we don't turn into people who practice inequity, because we see it time and time again, right? There's
Yeah.
that quote like, absolute power corrupts absolutely, and we
Yeah.
don't want, when we get into that situation, I don't want to be the arbiter of like who gets what, because I'm subject to bias as well.
Yeah.
So I need to make sure that the rules we set up in place are the most fair, and that's how we make sure they're also the most just and bring about the most dignity in other people.
Mm. Um, so you mentioned that this struggle took you 7.5 years, and I remember some while ago coming across the term racism fatigue. The topic of racism always keeps coming back. So how do you see it? Do you ever have this sense, or is it this term that you find odious, or how do you see this?
Yeah, I think racism fatigue or just kind of fatigue in general, if people feel like they're just tired of hearing about something over and over again, right?
Mm,
And there's a the South Asian comedian who says like saying I'm obsessed with racism is like telling someone who's drowning that they're obsessed with swimming. It,
mm,
it's it's a part of our survival. It's a part of our existence. So of course we're going to talk about it. And I think when people feel like we're talking about it too much, it's because they don't understand what is happening for those who are living with like a daily oppression. And that's when it's more important than ever for us to tap into our capacity to be compassionate and empathetic to others. And I do understand where it's coming from because
yeah,
like I don't want to like constantly hearing about like like atrocities around the world.
yeah,
And so it is important to like practice self-care, but it's also important to hold on to our ability to be compassionate to other people.
mm,
And my advice for those who are working in the movement fighting against racism is that we need to be a little bit more creative. We need to understand that there are many, many emotions. There's many
mm,
vehicles for change. It's not just about anger. It's not. It could also be. We can use joy as a way to fight racism.
yeah,
That's why I love comedy because it's so effective at getting people to think about things in new ways. I
yeah,
love art because it allows us to tap into compassion when we
yeah.
are able to see the humanity in other people.
Yeah, exactly. To mine these positive inner resources. Um, I would like to use a quote from your website as a little jumping off point. The circuit judge for the U.S. Court of Appeals for the federal court, Kimberly Moore, stated, "Words, even a single word, can be powerful." Mr. Simon Tam named his band the Slants to make a statement about racial and cultural issues in this country. With his band name, Mr. Tam conveys more about our society than many volumes of undisputedly protected speech. So, looking at it from today, what is the statement you are making and you were making with that band name?
Yeah, I mean, I think with the band name, we were trying to call attention to this outdated racial stereotype.
Hmm.
It was really about kind of flipping this slur on its head. And and at the same time, I love puns. I love language, and because I think it's like art. It's being playful with these
Yeah.
ideas, and for me, it was like, oh, what is our slant on life? What is our perspective as Asian Americans? And how can we contribute to this conversation? These days I don't think too much about the band name. I just kind of think of
Mm.
it as that's my band.
Yeah.
It's not really the word. And more so now, it's like I think of it as like that's the work of our foundation is
Yeah.
trying to use that perspective to help shape culture. So I think language can be a very, very powerful tool, both for good, in creating change, but also for bad. Like we can use words in a way that tap into people's trauma. We can use words
Mm.
to hurt. So it's that double-edged sword. But like any kind of blade, we can even it could be used for harm, like it could take another's life, or it could in the hands of a surgeon, it could save a life. And
Yeah.
so I'm always thinking about like how can I make sure the words I use are in a positive way, that it is contributing to helping heal and save lives as opposed to hurting and harming other people.
Yeah. Yeah, so there is this very important question of language in art, in music, and I wanted to zoom out a little bit to the global level of pop culture, and actually, maybe it could also be seen as a bit doubling down on this topic, because in pop music, in hip hop as well as rock in your case, there is often this question of reappropriating derogatory expressions and using them for one's own purposes, so to speak. And so, to what degree do you think this approach of reappropriating these expressions can be helpful in the fight against racism? And how can maybe problems crop up with this?
Yeah, I mean, I think reappropriation is just a very messy process.
Mm,
Like, but it's one that people have been doing for generations, like thousands of years.
yeah,
And I think it is most effective when it is supported by the community and embraced by those who are impacted by words, as opposed to when it's more contentious. But even then, even when like you think about like the N word, it's very contentious here in the United States.
yeah,
It is still powerful because it evokes a reaction, and it's so powerful that people dare not even speak it or write it.
yeah,
So I think it highlights that power of words and the ability to like shape dialogue. And so, I think that we we shouldn't be shy from using reappropriation as a tool, and but just we need to also see it as one of many different tools to get at change. It's because um, like I said, it can be that double-edged sword, and it's both in whose hands it's in and the intention to shape it. But more importantly, we need to be able to, as you say, zoom out and think about what is that global impact? What is that change we're actually seeking to create? Is it using a word in a way that's satirical or ironic, and in doing so, you know, highlighting something else in our world about it? And if so, hey, that's great. We know satire is a very, very powerful form of shaping discourse.
yeah,
Is it a way to seize a word and try and empower ourselves through it? I feel like that was my intention with Slant. That's the empower of like the queer community, taking
yeah,
this slur and absolutely making it their own and saying like we're going to use this and really be a powerful way to galvanize a group of people. Or is it a way to like have contentious and ruckus conversation about it, much like the N word, and create power in a different kind of way of like making it so powerful only certain members of the community ought or certain people
yeah.
ought to be you being able to use it. I think there's a lot of different ways and a lot of potential to use things in a really powerful way to make good trouble, so to speak.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I also just realized that I have this um yeah, my thoughts keep going back and forth about how to use this expression and when to appropriate them, because they have this awesome power, and it's never quite clear when when and how they can be also put to good use. So I'm coming close to the end, and it's this section which I call the non-trigger trigger. And the idea is that I give you a few just words and or brief expressions, and that you can then riff on them. Just maybe it could be one word, could be a little sentence, just to freestyle a little bit with that word I give you. And I know it can be, maybe difficult or challenging, or maybe the word is not really one you want to say anything about. So also feel free to skip the words and the trigger for thinking and ideas, but hopefully not triggering.
Okay. Fire
Okay.
away.
Okay. Yeah. So first one, Chinatown.
Chinatown. Wow. Uh, Chinatown's a really interesting one because in the United States in particular, it was both a place of exile because it was the
Uh,
only place that people of Asian descent were allowed to live, but it was also a refuge. And so here, a lot of people think of Chinatowns as just representing the Chinese community, but the reality, it's like all members of the Southeast Asian community were put there. So you'll see Vietnamese, you'll see Japanese, Koreans, etc. And unlike in their countries of origin, especially, 100, years ago, where there was a lot of division between Asian countries, when they came
Yeah.
here, they realized we were like, wow, they all treat us bad no matter what. So we might as
Yeah.
well start working together. And it became a little bit of a melting pot for different Asian cultures. And it's that that kind of complicated history, which is why our fans started calling our band's music Chinatown dance rock, because
Oh, wow.
we
Yeah.
were all variety of different Asian descent and ethnic identities coming together to form this band, and it just very much felt like a Chinatown, but within the music industry.
Yeah. Oh, that's fascinating to hear. I'm sure very few people have heard of this, that this also this melting pot dynamic. Yeah.
Yeah, it's there's a lot of hidden history, and nowadays Chinatowns across the U.S. and around the world, I would say, are experiencing yet another wave of change because a lot of them are gentrifying now. A
Yeah.
lot of the communities that made Chinatowns what they were are kind of being pushed out, and so they might have the occasional business there, but more and more we're seeing like big global corporation change.
Mm.
Like, in Washington, D.C., the Chinatown, the main Chinatown gate, which is the entryway that beckons you into the community,
Mm.
there's not a single Asian establishment there.
Mm.
It's like Walgreens, it's CVS, it's like
Oh,
Starbucks,
yeah.
but it's like really fascinating because you see this big thing that looks Chinese like, and then you realize it's like there's like a Jimmy John's sandwich shop, but there's like no no actual Chinese restaurant.
That that sounds very disheartening. Yeah.
Yeah, so we're seeing a lot of change, and that's going to be part of those discussions moving forward. Like if they're uh if they should be preserved in the way that they are, or how should they evolve and how should they change, and what can we do to better support those communities?
Yeah. Next one, very controversial. Well, depends, but yeah, next one, stay woke.
Stay woke. I'm one of those people who I don't mind the term woke because I'm like, yeah, if you don't want to be asleep, you don't want to be oblivious to what's happening around the world around
Yeah.
you. But more and more, what we're seeing is like people on the far right, people who are, against uh, efforts of diversity and inclusion are trying to make woke a bad word. Uh,
Yeah.
in the U.S. in particular, we see certain political factions making woke a something that's to be avoided, and they kind of
Mm.
make fun of the term. But I don't think we should allow people to reappropriate that term because I think it's a good one. It's important, and it's like, why do we want to allow ourselves to be mocked by it? But more important than the actual phrase itself, I think we need to think about the meaning and the intention behind it. And so whether people choose to use the word woke or aware or whatever else, we need to be mindful of like making sure we're effective at communicating with other people. Yeah, it's kind of
Mm.
like reappropriation, right? It's only going to be effective if people understand your intention, or if it's making the impact that you want to make.
Yeah.
So I get less hung up over the specific words and more about, are we being effective at communicating or conveying our thoughts and ideas? And if we're not, then perhaps then we should reconsider how we choose to go about using those phrases.
Yeah. Yeah, I was also very surprised when this word was suddenly because I only knew it from hip hop tracks. So I
Yeah,
remember
absolutely.
listening to Papoose and he said, "Stay woke means know your history and know your rights." And I was then later quite shocked when I was seeing all these right-wing pundits trying to give a negative spin to it.
Yeah, I mean, it's very much from that era of like conscious hip hop, and I think it's so important to like for folks who, especially if you love music, to recognize that history and then say like, well, hey, let's not let these people distort that, like, and erase it. Like,
Mm.
let's keep it in the conversation, but also at the same time, if we're going to influence those people, maybe find phrases that are meaningful to them. So it's just like understanding some terms are very in community for people who like understand and like, oh, I get what you're saying. And some terms ought to be used for those outside of our connected communities.
Mm,
And so like when I'm working in advocating for legislative change, I'll oftentimes use terms that are more friendly to people of other political persuasions,
yeah,
and because it's more effective at reaching that change. But if I'm amongst people, peers who have shared values and understandings that I have, then we might use a different language. So that's just kind of also part of that kind of reappropriation kind of conversation.
yeah. So the next door taps right into that. I came across it while doing my research. It's banana.
Banana. Oh, like are you talking about like an Asian American kind of term? Or
I
people
came
are
across this doing research. I know I mean, it's really not a good term, but so yeah.
yeah, people kind of say you're yellow on the outside, white on the inside kind of thing.
Mhm.
And then there's the reverse of that is the egg. Like people are
Mhm.
like white on the outside, but
Ah,
yellow on the inside. So people
yeah,
are like really like white folks who are obsessed with Asian culture.
yeah,
So
yeah,
we see this in many different ways. I think that it's oftentimes used in a cultural context, like a person who is like a banana is like someone who's just obsessed with like say white culture, white
mm,
music, white food, while they're Asian. That was me, honestly, growing up, because I didn't want to be associated with Asian culture. From all
mm,
the bullying, I became very ashamed of my culture. And it
mm,
wasn't until I later in my life that I started realizing that I am both an American, as someone who's born in this country, in this culture, and I'm also my family. I'm also my cultural inheritance, and I came to realize that I can all these different parts of me can coexist in the same person.
mm,
So I think of it's kind of a playful insult more than anything, but like I think we should realize that it's more than just that pop culture. It's like we can hold multiple complex identities,
yeah,
and you know, I if someone ever were to use it at me, I wouldn't take offense to it. I'd more think it's funny than anything. But I could see how it could be hurtful to someone, especially if they're trying to they're in a different point in their journey. They're trying to discover who they are,
mm,
and it's important to like to try and think about when we're using these kinds of terms, like are we doing it from a place of uh, hate? Are we doing it from a place of like disgruntledness, anger? Are we doing it
mm,
from a place of joy and playfulness? And like we should be more mindful of just not being jerks to others, just in
mm,
general.
yeah. Um, yeah, I do. I mean, there are obviously also equivalents in for other categories of people of this term, and I personally always found it very difficult to deal with because it reduces it to this binary. You have this here, the white people, the Asian people, the black people, and it's to me at least it's quite a bit of a fantasy.
Yeah, like we don't need to be wasting our time trying to divide
Yeah,
people up anymore. We've got plenty of that already. You
yeah,
know, the irony is like, so just share this real quick is like, in the United States, our band is always seen as an Asian American band. We
mhm,
identify ourselves as an Asian American band. So like that's just how it is.
yeah,
When we were touring Asia, and we were saying, "Oh, we're like an Asian American band, or we're also Chinese and Taiwanese and things like
mhm.
that." They're like, "No, you're Americans." Like they didn't see us as Asian. Oh, they're
That's
like, "What?"
funny.
So they just like, "Yeah, you're American."
Yeah.
Like that's funny because yeah, in America, I'm not seen as American.
Yeah. The identity changes with the context. So
Yeah.
actually, the way we are doing this, I have to say, is much more interesting and satisfying right now. But I'm going to challenge you, in the spirit of this non-trigger trigger, to condense it to one sentence. I know it's tough.
Okay. Yeah.
The Constitution.
Constitution. Idealistic and evolving.
Black Lives Matter.
Truth.
Immigrants.
Oh, that's funny. It makes me think of Hamilton.
Yeah,
uh, get the job done. But I would say all of us,
mm,
except for indigenous folks.
indeed. President Obama.
Uh, Important and complicated.
Philanthropy.
A starting point for change.
Then
Yeah.
Portland.
Portland, America's whitest major city.
And finally, black, brown, yellow, white.
I think a representation of the many colors of humanity.
Hmm, thank you. And the last part is a bit yeah, about what you can recommend and also looking forward into the future. So the first question would be, what kind of music and movie recommendations would you make to our viewers?
Well, I would say right now I'm a little biased on it, but I would suggest looking into the artists that we're working with at the Slants Foundation. So we have a program called Asian Pacifics,
Yeah.
that is arming young artists to and challenging them to write music around social causes that are near and dear to their hearts.
Mhm.
You go to the slants.org, you can learn more about the program, but they're doing some really incredible things. And I would encourage folks to explore and check out their music.
Okay, excellent. And then, yeah, some movies and books which you could recommend to the viewers.
Movies and books. Oh my goodness.
Sorry,
That's
it's a
a
bit,
very big
I don't want to
question.
put you on the spot, but maybe some slowly bubble up.
Is it specifically around like racial identity or just
No,
like any?
just generally speaking, you as a human being, artist, activist, what kind of books and movies? They don't have to be recent, even. Yeah.
Okay. When I was growing up, I was really obsessed with this Tom Hanks movie called That Thing You Do.
Mm.
About kind of like a band, kind of like the Beatles or Monkees making its way to prominence. And I love pop music and history. And so it was a very good look at 50s and 60s music
Yeah.
and kind of funny way of just looking at how life is in a band, to the extent where one of the main cast members, the bass player in the band, didn't
Mm.
actually have a name. Every other character had a name, and he was
Correct.
just known as the bass player. And even
Uh,
the it just says TB player, as in the bass player. And as a bass player, I appreciated that because we never get any love. So that was really fun for me. But yeah, I love like music biopics, whether they're like fictionalized or not, because
mm.
it's fun seeing the kind of journey that artists might take or what people think the artist journey is like. So
Yeah.
that one. In terms of books, there's so many. I think like music movies, I really enjoy reading memoirs. So, like Bruce Springsteen has a really incredible memoir that I think it taps into this idea of like songwriting and the magic of making songs that I
Mm.
really love. Uh, I also am a big fan of like philosophy and thought processes. So the one
Yeah.
I mentioned earlier, John Rawlings, The Theory of Justice. It's
Yeah.
not a light read, I'll say that.
Yeah.
But I think it's a very important one, and it's a great way to start thinking about why we think about the way we do, like why we have the ideas that we do have. I
Yeah.
think it's very fantastic for that. So those are some of my kind of like things that come to mind. Um, but yeah, if you like surreal fiction, I'm also a big fan of Haruki Murakami. There's
Yeah.
a great book called 1Q84 that I think also like really plays with ideas around identity and humanity and what that all means.
Mm.
So it's a fun, twisted look at Orwell's 1984.
That sounds very interesting because I was also, yeah, I've been meaning to read Murakami for a long time. So it is such a wealth where to start. So it's nice to hear some recommendations.
Oh yeah. I mean, just a great author, just very beautiful uses of language and
Mm,
prose. And a lot of times I mean, 1Q84 is like on the more complex end for him, but a
mm,
lot of times the stories are fairly simple. It's more about the inner journey and the thoughts of the characters that are very complex because I think that is kind of life. Like we can find ourselves reduced to just our actions, but what really makes it rich is like what's going on in our minds and what's
yeah,
shaping our thoughts.
yeah. And finally, we've heard also about some of your open projects, but one of the questions I like to ask, it's a bit difficult, but are there certain open questions or things that are not so clear that, keep coming back to you? Some questions that are kind of like come back, or some topics that keep coming back, at night, early in the morning, something that like kind of, yeah, that is
Uh,
working in your mind.
yeah, yeah. So there's something that's been on my mind, kind of quite a bit. It's like how we're identified by various moments in our life. So
Mm,
you reached out probably because of the Supreme Court case, or certainly asked me about it. And I
mm,
think about it, and I'm like, that was a pretty big chunk of my life, almost a
yeah,
decade. But it was also almost a decade ago. And most people who know me for that case. And I keep thinking like, but I've lived so much life after that. Like I'm also this other person now, and so I keep thinking about like how that journey has shaped me and what is the journey up ahead. Like if for the rest of my life I will be known as the guy who won this Supreme Court case, or
mm,
is there something else in my life that I would like to be known by and what that means? And
mm,
so, in music, there is um, there's this idea called a reprise,
mm,
which is just kind of like a repeated idea or repeated musical phrase.
mm,
But oftentimes, the reprise in music is also when the idea appears later on, but subtly different.
yeah,
And so I keep thinking about our lives as people. What is our reprise? Like, what are the ideas that keep appearing in our life, and how can we make them a little bit different? What is that like that next phase of our lives? Because I think a lot of us end up becoming known, having a reputation amongst our friends, our peers, or greater society by something that we do. But are we always going to be defined by that idea, or
yeah,
do we also have the capacity to change and evolve beyond that? And if we do, how do we make that happen?
yeah,
So, I wrote a memoir and it came out 5 years ago. Uh, and I'm like, I still theoretically have a lot of life to live, but what
yeah,
is that second memoir gonna look like? What is that? So that shapes both my thinking. It also shapes like what I would like to engage in because I want to continue making art. I want to continue making a difference. So
mm,
what is that next act going to look like?
mm. Yeah, I was thinking that you're when I was doing research, that you're probably tired of this Supreme Court question, but then I was thinking of it, this is more like a point of access to the world of all these topics and all these issues. And I mean, very obviously, you're already so far along in all these new
Yeah,
ventures
I
with
mean,
your
I certainly don't mind.
foundation, etc. Yeah.
Yeah, I still get asked, to go and speak to
Yeah.
students or law conventions and that sort of thing about the case, and
Mm,
it's certainly fine. I think of it as a starting point rather than as a finishing point, and
yeah.
it's like if it gets me in the door and I can share these other ideas and hopefully bring more support to the causes I care about, then I gladly do it.
Yeah.
And so, but it is like this kind of interesting idea of like we're more than just a fixed point in our lives, you
Yeah.
know, in the same way that you asked me about like President Obama. It's like he hasn't been president for a minute, and people keep thinking of him like as his presidency. I think of him as like, well, he's not just that president who,
Yeah.
had these policies, some were successful, some were less so.
Yeah.
He also has the foundation, and he's been cultivating leaders for a very long time.
Yeah.
So it's like he has this whole other life.
Yeah.
And so it's like, in some ways, I think we should honor that. But
Yeah.
how can he get beyond perhaps being, the quote unquote leader of the free world? Like, how does he get out from under that title into thinking like he can also be something even greater than that?
Yeah. Yeah, 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 it's, I suppose, very difficult to act, but I find it beautiful the image you have of this reprise. For myself, I've realized it emotionally now that we have a child. I feel like it's a reprise of my emotional life when I was small, kind of opening up into the world, which I didn't feel, but. Yeah, it's topics we have to work through again and again across our lives. Yeah. Yeah, this is already the end of our interview here on Black, Brown, Yellow, White, episode 7 with Simon Tam. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for having me.
And yeah, it's been